In the 1950s, a scientist sat in his laboratory with a problem. Heart disease was killing Americans at an unprecedented rate. President Eisenhower had just suffered a heart attack, and the nation was panicking. This scientist had a theory, he had ambition, and he had something else, the willingness to ignore any data that contradicted his predetermined conclusion. His name was Ancel Keys, and the dietary guidelines he created through manipulated research still control what you eat today. What your children are fed in schools, what your doctor recommends, and what food manufacturers are allowed to claim as healthy. This is the story of how one man's scientific fraud became nutritional dogma, and how the consequences of his deception are still killing people 70 years later. Before we dive into this story, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? Drop your country or city in the comments, because I genuinely love seeing how far these investigations reach. Are you watching from the US, where these guidelines originated? From Europe, where they were adopted? Or somewhere else entirely? Let me know. It helps me understand who's uncovering this hidden history alongside me. Now, let's get into how one scientist's ego and a stack of cherry-picked data changed the world. The year is 1953. America is terrified. Heart disease rates have exploded since the turn of the century, and nobody knows why. Doctors are baffled, the public is scared, and scientists are racing to find an answer. Into this chaos steps Ancel Keys, a physiologist at the University of Minnesota. Keys is ambitious, charismatic, and utterly convinced he already knows the answer. Dietary fat, especially saturated fat from meat and dairy, is killing Americans. He doesn't need to prove it, he just needs to make everyone else believe it, and he has a plan to do exactly that. Keys begins gathering data from around the world, looking at the relationship between fat consumption and heart disease rates in different countries. He collects information from 22 countries, a comprehensive dataset that should reveal the truth. But when he analyzes all 22 countries, the data doesn't show what he wants it to show. The correlation between fat intake and heart disease is weak, inconsistent, and certainly not strong enough to support his hypothesis. So Keys makes a decision that will echo through decades of nutritional science and public health policy. He simply throws out the data from 16 countries, the ones that don't fit his narrative, and publishes a study using only 6 countries that appear to show a strong correlation between fat consumption and heart disease deaths. This is the famous 7 countries study, except it wasn't 7 countries in the beginning. It was 6, carefully selected to prove a predetermined conclusion. Keys chose Japan, with low fat intake and low heart disease, Italy, Yugoslavia, Netherlands, Finland, and the United States, with higher fat intake and higher heart disease rates. When plotted on a graph, these 6 countries created a beautiful upward curve. More fat equals more heart disease. It looked convincing, it looked scientific, and it was completely dishonest. The countries Keys excluded told a very different story. France had high saturated fat consumption but low heart disease rates, a phenomenon that would later be called the French paradox. Switzerland, similar story, lots of cheese and butter, low heart disease. West Germany, high fat intake, moderate heart disease. Chile, low fat intake, high heart disease. The data Keys threw away demolished his hypothesis, so he simply pretended it didn't exist. But Keys wasn't finished. He expanded his research into what became known as the 7 countries study. Published in 1970, an ambitious long-term investigation comparing diet and disease rates across multiple nations. This study is still cited today as foundational evidence for low-fat dietary guidelines. But the 7-country study had problems, serious methodological problems that any honest scientist should have addressed. First, Keys handpicked the countries again, choosing populations he knew would support his hypothesis, while excluding countries that wouldn't. Second, he ignored other variables that might explain heart disease rates, like sugar consumption, smoking rates, stress levels, industrialization, and genetic factors. Third, and most damningly, even within his selected countries, the data showed massive inconsistencies that Keyes glossed over or explained away. Let's look at some specifics. In Crete, one of the Greek islands Keyes studied, people consumed large amounts of olive oil, a fat, yet had very low heart disease rates. Keyes explained this away by claiming olive oil was somehow different, a special exception. But this directly contradicted his core hypothesis that dietary fat causes heart disease. If fat was the problem, why wasn't olive oil a problem? Keyes never adequately answered this question. In Finland, the eastern regions had much higher heart disease rates than western regions, despite similar fat consumption. Keyes attributed this to the type of fat, but the data didn't really support this explanation either. The inconsistencies were everywhere, but Keyes had an answer for everything, or rather, he had excuses for everything. Meanwhile, other scientists were finding very different results. British researcher John Yudkin was investigating sugar, not fat, as the primary dietary cause of heart disease. Yudkin's research showed strong correlations between sugar consumption and heart disease, correlations that were actually stronger than Keyes' fat correlations. Yudkin pointed out that the rise in heart disease in America coincided with a dramatic increase in sugar consumption, not fat consumption. Americans had been eating animal fat for generations without epidemic heart disease, but sugar consumption had skyrocketed in the early 20th century, right when heart disease rates began climbing. Yudkin published his findings. He wrote books. He presented at conferences. But he couldn't compete with Ancel Keys. Keyes was a master of academic politics. He was loud, aggressive, and ruthlessly effective at destroying anyone who disagreed with him. When Yudkin presented his sugar hypothesis, Keyes didn't engage with the science. He attacked Yudkin personally, calling him a fool and dismissing his research as incompetent. Keyes had powerful allies. He sat on influential committees. He had the ear of the American Heart Association, and he knew how to work the media. Yudkin was a quiet British researcher who believed the data would speak for itself. It didn't. Keyes drowned him out, marginalized him, and effectively ended his career. By the time Yudkin died in 1995, his work had been almost completely forgotten, buried under decades of low-fat dogma. But Keyes wasn't working alone. Behind the scenes, a very interested party was watching this scientific debate and quietly placing bets: the sugar industry. In the 1960s, internal sugar industry documents, which wouldn't be uncovered until 2016, show that sugar executives were deeply concerned about research linking sugar to heart disease. They needed a different villain, and Ancel Keys was offering them one fat. The Sugar Research Foundation, now called the Sugar Association, paid 3 Harvard scientists to publish a review article in the New England Journal of Medicine downplaying the link between sugar and heart disease, while emphasizing the dangers of fat. The scientists were paid the equivalent of $50,000 in today's money. They did not disclose this conflict of interest, and their article helped shift the scientific consensus away from sugar and toward fat. This wasn't conspiracy theory. These are documented facts revealed when a researcher at the University of California, San Francisco, discovered the internal sugar industry. Documents in 2016. The industry knew sugar was harmful. They knew the science was pointing at them, and they paid to redirect blame onto fat. And it worked. By the 1970s, the fat hypothesis had won. In 1977, the United States government published the first dietary goals for Americans, recommending that people reduce their fat intake, especially saturated fat, and increase their carbohydrate consumption. These guidelines were based largely on Ancel Keys' research, the same research built on cherry-picked data and ignored contradictions. The food pyramid followed, with its base of bread, cereal, rice, and pasta, 6 to 11 servings per day of carbohydrates, and its tiny tip of fats and oils to be used sparingly. The consequences were catastrophic. Americans followed the guidelines. They reduced fat consumption, they increased carbohydrate consumption, and they got sicker. Obesity rates, which had been relatively stable for decades, began climbing in the 1980s and have never stopped. Type 2 diabetes, once a rare disease, became epidemic. Heart disease rates, which had been declining since the 1960s due to reduced smoking and better emergency care, stopped declining as fast. The low-fat era created the conditions for a public health disaster, and we're still living in it. Food manufacturers love the low-fat guidelines because fat carries flavor, and when you remove fat from food, it tastes like cardboard. So manufacturers replace the fat with sugar, high-fructose corn syrup, and other refined carbohydrates. Low-fat yogurt, low-fat cookies, low-fat salad dressing, all loaded with sugar to make them palatable. Supermarket shelves filled with processed foods labeled heart-healthy because they were low in fat, even though they were nutritional garbage. The food pyramid didn't just recommend carbohydrates. It created a financial incentive to produce cheap, shelf-stable, highly processed carbohydrate products, and the food industry responded with enthusiasm. Meanwhile, the science kept contradicting the guidelines, but the guidelines didn't change. Study after study failed to find strong evidence that saturated fat caused heart disease. The Women's Health Initiative, one of the largest nutritional studies ever conducted, put nearly 50,000 women on a low-fat diet for 8 years and found no significant reduction in heart disease, stroke, or cancer. The results were published in 2006, and they should have ended the low-fat era. They didn't. The guidelines barely budged. In 2010, a meta-analysis published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition reviewed 21 studies involving nearly 350,000 people and found no significant evidence that saturated fat increases the risk of heart disease or stroke. Again, the guidelines barely changed. Why? Because changing dietary guidelines means admitting the previous guidelines were wrong and admitting the previous guidelines were wrong means admitting that decades of public health policy were based on fraudulent science, and admitting that means accepting responsibility for an obesity and diabetes epidemic that has killed millions of people and cost trillions of dollars. No government agency wants to do that. No public health official wants their legacy to be, "We told you to eat the wrong foods for 50 years, and it killed you." So the guidelines stay mostly the same, with minor tweaks and careful language that avoids admitting error. Ansel Keys died in 2004 at the age of 100, having lived long enough to see his hypothesis become nutritional dogma and to see the obesity epidemic his guidelines helped create. He never admitted he was wrong. He never acknowledged the data he'd thrown away or the scientists he'd destroyed. And he never apologized for the millions of people harmed by policies based on his manipulated research. He died believing he had saved the world from heart disease, even as heart disease remained the leading killer in America, and obesity rates had tripled since his guidelines were adopted. The story of Ansel Keys is not just about one scientist's fraud. It's about how scientific institutions can be corrupted, how economic interests can shape public health policy, and how once a narrative becomes established, it becomes almost impossible to dislodge, even when the evidence against it is overwhelming. It's about the difference between science and science, between the messy, uncertain, constantly evolving process of discovering truth and the authoritative, confident, institutionally sanctioned pronouncements that governments and corporations use to control behavior and maximize profit. Today, the dietary guidelines are slowly changing, very slowly. The 2020 guidelines finally removed the recommendation to limit total fat intake, focusing instead on the types of fat. But saturated fat is still vilified. Carbohydrates are still the base of the recommended diet, and the food pyramid's legacy lives on in school lunch programs, hospital meals, and nutrition labels. The system Ansel Keys helped build is still standing, even as the foundation crumbles beneath it. What can we learn from this? First, that scientific consensus is not the same as scientific truth, and that consensus can be manufactured through politics, money, and personality rather than data. Second, that public health guidelines are not neutral, objective recommendations. They are shaped by economic interests, institutional inertia, and the egos of influential individuals. Third, that when science becomes dogma, when questioning is treated as heresy, when contradictory evidence is ignored or suppressed, people die. Not metaphorically, not eventually, but actually, predictably, and preventably. The low-fat dietary guidelines were supposed to save us from heart disease. Instead, they gave us an obesity epidemic, a diabetes epidemic, and a food system optimized for profit rather than health. They were based on fraudulent research, promoted by a scientist who cared more about being right than about finding the truth, and supported by an industry that saw an opportunity to shift blame away from its own products. And 70 years later, we're still eating the consequences. This is the hidden history of your diet, the story of how one scientist rigged the data and changed what billions of people eat. This is why Arcane 44 exists, to pull back the veil on the money and power that shaped your plate, to show you how the foods you were told are healthy were chosen not by science, but by politics and profit. If you want more investigations into the hidden forces that control your health, subscribe, because this is just the beginning. There are more lies to uncover, more villains to expose, and more truth to reveal. The question is, are you ready to see how deep this goes?